Hello, I'm Pastor Paul. Welcome to the Lord of Life Lutheran Church Sermon Podcast. We're glad you're here. We know that you can't always be in worship with us, so we're glad to provide the sermons from our weekly services. We hope that you will find hope and inspiration as we have in Jesus Christ. And now, here's this week's message. The Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' you will be liable to hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First, be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court, while you're on your way to court with him, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better you have to lose one of your members than your whole body to go into hell. It was also said, 'Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce.' But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you have made to the Lord.' But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is the footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise you, Lord. You may be seated. Sometimes, when I read a text, I ask myself a few questions. And this was certainly a week of that. And sometimes when I read a text out loud in worship and I get to the end where I say the Gospel of the Lord, I want to say, the Gospel of the Lord? This is a sermon, I will confess to you, that didn't come together until last night. So forgive me if I'm a little bit too dependent on the manuscript, but this reading is a very challenging one for us to hear. You might hear yourself in the story, and it might influence what you take away from the sermon. Every single one of us can see ourselves, can hear ourselves in the text somewhere. That's kind of the point of Jesus teaching the way that he does. We could spend a lot of time working on these commandments and Jesus' expansion on them and what they mean, but that's not the point, at least not for this morning. We're going to focus on things like relationship and righteousness, which are more the point of this text, I think. We can dig into it more deeply during our Bible study that happens in March on the Gospel of Matthew. You're welcome to join us then. But in the meantime, if you hear something in this reading today that causes you to stumble, that causes you to stop and think and wonder, and it is disconcerting for you, please know that you can come and talk to me at any time. Okay, ready? Let's begin with context. I like context. Matthew's gospel addresses issues of identity and lifestyle, which were important to his primarily Jewish audience. The writer wants to talk about the broken relationships that exist between the Jews and those who followed Jesus, who believed Jesus to be the Messiah, and their synagogues and the Jewish leaders of the day, primarily scribes and Pharisees. Matthew wants to help this group to now estranged Jewish people to find their identity and to help shape what would look like, what it would become to look like being a faithful person or a faithful life of a Jesus follower. Today's reading follows on the heels of the teaching on the mountainside, a sermon we refer to as the Beatitudes. Do you remember that from a couple weeks ago? And in that sermon, Jesus talks about Rome's rule and the pain it has brought to the people, and about how God overcomes this pain. And Jesus goes on to address the rewards for those who lead a life of faithfulness. Then comes the reading where Jesus tells his disciples within earshot of the crowd what it means to live into these Beatitudes for their lives of discipleship. You are salt, Jesus says. You are salt, Jesus says. You are light. Yes, thank you. Last week, salt and light, remember? And Jesus has come to fulfill the law, not to dismiss the law. That was the other key part of last week's reading. So today's reading is a continuation of sorts of the readings from the past 2 weeks. It also carries deep meaning and ties into the larger arc of the narrative of the Gospel of Matthew. You know what an arc of a story is? It carries through from the beginning to the end, right? So this reading is hard, and I'm afraid too often we might read what Jesus is saying and just chalk it up and say, oh, that's impossible, we can't do it, but God's grace will cover us, without really working on what the reading says. Fair enough? Now, the good news is that God's grace does cover our mistakes. It is about righteousness and relationship. Righteousness not as in our own ability to perfectly live out the law. Only Christ can do that. But righteousness as in we are the ones called by the promise of God to love our God and to love and serve our neighbor. Relationship as in we are called to love God and our neighbor, not with simple platitudes or just writing a check. I believe that Jesus is using these texts, starting with the Beatitudes, including salt and light, and today's challenging deep dive into the commandments, to show the people, and us by association, that the law is about life, and that the old law of the Hebrew Scriptures is good. But by itself, it is not enough to build a life of righteousness and meaning. The law is about more than simply saying what is and isn't permissible, but about a whole way of being. It speaks to us about who we are and about what a religious life looks like. It helps us to understand what a life of relationship with God looks like for us and for the other. Jesus is saying within his address of the law that if we want to be about actions, here is what is required. Want to understand our accountability to the world and each other? Here you go. Jesus shows that the old ways of understanding the law, the ways popularized by the scribes and Pharisees, have missed the intent of the law. Have you ever heard that saying before? There's the letter of the law and then there's the intent of the law. Watch more of NCIS or one of those other cool shows. The law is about a bigger vision of holiness and tapping into the security that God promises and provides. It isn't attainable simply by what you do and what you don't do. There's a deeper sense of righteousness that permeates one's life and society that can find its source only in God. Dr. David Lose put it this way: The function of the law is God saying, this is who you are my people, and this is how others will know who you are, that you are my people. It's about the relationship between God and us and between us and others. It's about the deep relationship between God and God's people, but also points to God's love for the other. Jesus is calling us back into deep relationship and commitment to what the law actually means, and by connection to each other and the other. You get what I mean when I'm talking about that? Who is it that's not here? Who is it that God loves, who is not present with us? And the gift of today's reading and the readings of recent weeks regarding the law is that through them, the writer of Matthew offers us a vision of identity and lifestyle. Remember, I said at the beginning that the Gospel of Matthew's intention, at least in part, is to give those early followers of Jesus a sense of purpose, identity, and how to live a life of faith. And isn't it interesting that we live now in a time when a life of faith is seen as unusual or as an outside type activity? It doesn't mean that we can reduce the Christian life to a checklist of things to do. Yep, got up, did that this morning, prayed, went and saw this person. That's kind of where the Pharisees and the scribes got off track. They reduced the law into a list of things to do. Jesus' intent, it seems, is to remind us, you and me, that the law is not about an accounting, but about relationship. Once we understand that, we're freed to ask the right questions. How is my behavior affecting my relationship with God and my neighbor? I think Jesus' words are about encouraging us to think differently about how we find our meaning in the world and about how we make a life and a being in the world. Faith is situated in the promise of God. It's also a calling. Jesus calls you and me into a deeper relationship with God, and in so doing offers us a way to think about how we still live in response by loving God and loving neighbor more fully. This deeper relationship is what I talked about at our annual meeting, if you were in attendance just a few weeks ago. I asked you to think about how you might take one more step in your faith journey, about how you might lean more fully into God's love for you in Jesus Christ. Last week, I invited you to pray and meditate during a time of silence during the sermon. And I asked you to think about how God had been good to you. How God had been good to you. And I invited you to think about how you might be salt and light in this congregation, in our community, and in our world. Today's reading is difficult, for sure. But it's another invitation to think about how God has been good to you, about what it means to love God and our neighbor, about what it means to take one more step in our journey of faith. And I pray that God will surround you with possibilities and that you might be assured of God's grace and love for you today and always. Amen. Thanks for listening to the Lord of Life Lutheran Church Sermon Podcast. If you're ever in the Dubuque-land area, please join us for worship. Visit our website at www.lordoflife.online to learn more about service times and about our vision for serving God and our community. God bless you.